Good morning. 3 minutes after 10 is the time, and it's going to be a scorcher. Do you remember those headlines? They probably still do them. Phew, what a scorcher. It's such an easy front page to write, and it is going to be huge, although it's underpinned, I think, by this growing sense that the supply of water in this country has gone horribly wrong. The relationship between water company and customer has gone absolutely horribly wrong. One thinks I think, not first necessarily, but fairly quickly, of Fergal Sharkey, who has been campaigning tirelessly, almost by accident. I don't know if you've listened to my full disclosure interview with him, but it was really his passion for trout fishing, his passion for fishing in chalk streams that led him to discover just how much damage was being done to that part of our I don't know what you'd call it, aquatic welfare. And following on from that, he looks at what the water companies were doing. And following on from that, he will be one of the least surprised people on the planet about what we are now discovering at breakneck speed about the relationship between water company and customer. Nick this morning running through some of these rewards that are still set to be paid to the bosses, to the big cheeses in water supply. And you almost... I'm very conscious at the moment of sounding too confused every day, of having this sort of curious approach to the programme, which I stumbled across probably a couple of years ago, possibly even during COVID, where I tried to get you to explain to me what is going on. I'm not completely stupid. I do understand some of what is going on. But this one, I think, is really simple. I really think this one is easy. I don't think there's any mystery here. The only mystery is how we have been conditioned to put up with it. Nobody's allowed to be surprised today. If you privatise something, have a little think. I'm going in, all right? Here's political for you. For one of the early texts in actually telling me things are a lot better in Scotland. I don't know whether that's true, and I do wish some days that we had an international programme, albeit that my interest lies in the United Kingdom. My main reason for wanting a more international programme, we've got a pretty international programme. My main reason for wanting an international programme is comparison, because there is a sense, isn't there, that we're quite insular. We're probably more insular in 2022 than we were in 2002 or 2012, don't you think? We seem to be a more inward-looking country at the moment, and much of our most prominent media discourages contemplation. It doesn't like us looking beyond the end of our own gardens. But I don't know what's happening in other countries, and it would be relevant to the conversation that we're having. Is it the case in France, for example, that water is set to be rationed, or hose pipes are set to be banned, and sewage is more or less out of control, while the people that run the companies are trousering sums of money that look to the rest of us like telephone numbers? It seems incredible to me. It would be a bit like me presenting a radio show that nobody listens to, and not just presenting a radio show that nobody listens to, but a radio show that has the effect upon your ears that perhaps fingernails scraping along a blackboard have. Me presenting a radio show that is not just ambivalent or poor, but is objectively and abjectly awful, whatever the opposite of easy listening would be. The kind of radio that makes you almost want to claw off your own ears with your fingers. That's and then I kept getting pay rises. That seems to me to be the radio equivalent of how water companies are run in this country, would be every time someone turns off the radio, someone gives me a quid. Or every time I break Ofcom regulations or swear or offend someone unnecessarily or indulge in a bit of light racism or bigotry, homophobia, whatever it might be. Actually, that doesn't quite work, does it? That's quite a good business model. Indeed, they've set up entire television stations to thrive off that approach to things. But imagine if you turned on LBC at 10 o'clock in the morning and all you heard was the sound of fingernails being dragged across a blackboard, or you turned it off in double quick time. And they kept giving me a pay rise. That seems to me to be what is happening in our water companies. And that's why it would be interesting to know what happens in other countries, because you have a sort of perspective, don't you? You don't. If it's like this everywhere, then we can't really conclude that there's something uniquely awful about the way we're doing things. But if you don't have this everywhere, then you can. But here's the thing that occurred to me. South of France, I imagine they've already got a hose pipe ban, haven't they? I mean, you'd imagine. But are there companies there where people in charge are trousering huge sums of money while pumping effluent and sewage into our previously pristine waterways. I doubt it. Here's the thing, right? What are the abiding mantras of right-wing politics in this country over the last few decades and right up to now, right up to this minute? Because it's good to privatise things. That has been pretty much unchallenged since 1979. It's good to privatise things, and also, and this is very much a Tory thing, there's no New Labour echo here, deregulation. Down with regulation, down with rules, down with red tape. Now, listen, sometimes you think, that can't be it, can it? That's so obvious and so easy. Life must be more complicated. It must be more difficult than this attest. But from where I'm sitting this morning, it seems to me that if you prioritise profit for shareholders while simultaneously calling for less red tape, which is pretty much the definition of modern conservatism, isn't it? More privatisation, less red tape, or health and safety legislation, regulations to keep rivers clean, as we might call it. They would call it red tape. And then you fetishise wealth. You think that people who are earning huge sums of money are somehow better than the rest of us, which again is very, very much a mantra of modern conservatism. Then surely what we're looking at here is absolutely inevitable. How can right-wing journalists express surprise at what is happening here? How could people who perhaps doffed their cap towards Margaret Thatcher and still revere her memory be remotely surprised? And the selfish way to understand it, I think, is the amount of money in play for these people, being paid millions and millions of pounds, because they are not being paid to keep our rivers clean or to keep our water supply safe or to seal up leaks or to maximise the efficiency of the company that they run. They are being paid purely and simply to extract as much money out of that business, out of you and me, out of their customers, as is humanly possible. I do honestly believe that sometimes you have to resist the urge to overcomplicate things and overthink things. Take these three strands of modern history, okay? You can't have nationalisation. Oh, publicly owned institutions are terrible. They're sclerotic and they've got Spanish practices and they're held hostage by unions. All down with that sort of thing. Let's privatise everything. Number one. Number two, oh dear, oh, you're stifling business with all your red tape and your rules. Flipping builders having to wear hard hats. That's ridiculous. You don't need safety nets on scaffolding. Get rid of all that sort of stuff. Why? Well, because then the owners will be able to make more money. So deregulation or bonfires of red tape or whatever you want to call it. That's point two, right? And then point three, if someone's getting paid an absolute ton of money, they must be doing a good job. It goes without saying. There's no way that someone as thick as mince could end up being a multi-millionaire, Jacob Rees-Mogg. It just couldn't happen in this country. No, absolutely not. You get paid a ton of money. Forget what Balzac said about there being a great crime behind every great fortune. Or was it Tolstoy? I can never remember. But that's that. So those three things. So privatisation, deregulation, and fetishisation of wealth and high wages creates what we've got here. Filthy rivers. I mean, actual poo often being pumped into our waterways on a scale that we haven't seen for years. Brexit, of course, has made it worse, I think, because it's changed some of the requirements and responsibilities that we have. And then you have the rewards being paid to these people. It's absolutely inevitable. So why do we put up with it? And that's the question that I've got for you today. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. Millions in the southeast are already facing restrictions on using hose pipes and sprinklers. The amount of water that is lost to leakages because they don't look after The infrastructure is absolutely immense, but why would you look after the infrastructure if you don't have to? Deregulation. It's only money that would come out of dividends and profits, spending it on building new pipes or putting new stuff in. Why would you do it if you get to keep all the money that isn't spent at the end of the year? And we have had successive governments, certainly 12 years worth of governments, that just sit there going, yep, carry on, everything's wonderful. So why do we put up with it? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. Listen, I think I understand it. It's not one of those mornings where I sit here going, I just don't understand, please explain. I mean, challenge what I've said, unpick it if you want. I'm fairly confident that it is that simple. Privatisation, fetishization, deregulation creates these sort of monstrous scenarios. Why do we put up with it? Is a lovely question to ask, a lovely question to kick off. But I'd also like to know what else is happening elsewhere. What is happening elsewhere? And of course, a lot of these profits are not making their way into the pockets of these ordinary shareholders, if you like. They're making their way into the pockets of hedge funds and investment funds. You know, institutions and engines that exist solely to enrich the already rich. And that perhaps reaches your ears as sounding a bit Marxist or a bit left-wing. And that's part of the reason of why we put up with it, isn't it? Because we have, as a population, been successfully persuaded that people like Jacob Rees-Mogg are geniuses and people like Mick Lynch are troublemakers. Who would you trust to keep you safe or to keep your water clean? Yeah, exactly. So why do we put up with it? And what is happening elsewhere? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. And I'll give you an example. I'm on a constant... what's the word? I don't know. A constant roundabout when it comes to the idiot texts that come in. But I do read them out because these people are real. And there's a lot of them. So yesterday you talk about Gordon Brown. I promise you there are millions of people in this country go, well, he sold off all our gold, so we won't listen to him about anything. It's a very deliberate infantilization of the population. It's the only way you can create an environment in which, well, what we're talking about today can happen by portraying politicians dedicated to the idea of making your life better as being somehow incompetent or untrustworthy. So here's a text. Real person listening to the same programme you're listening to. You are disgusting. The EU forced privatisation, except for the evil BBC. You know this. That is real. These people are allowed, not only do they walk among us, they're allowed to use scissors. So part of the answer, and we may not like this, to the question of why do we put up with it, is because we've been turned in to a population full of people like that. Oh, that's ridiculous. You can't tax people more. You can't increase wages. You can't have more regulations on water companies pumping poo into our rivers. It's ridiculous. You've got to. What do you do for a living? Oh, I'm on minimum wage. But you absolutely got to stop going after the bosses with all this pesky red tape. Is that all of the answer to the question of why do we put up with it? And one very good way of finding out will, of course, be, what's it like where you are? Outside England. And I use England quite specifically because my texts already suggest that Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland may be a little bit different. But I'm afraid, to my eternal embarrassment, I don't actually, well, not eternal, because by 11 o'clock today I will know. But for my 43 minutes of embarrassment, I don't know. Right, Philly Boots, 034, but not your watering cans. 0345 6060 973. 10:18 is the time. Jeremy lives in Andalusia, says we've had no serious rainfall since May and probably won't have any until October or November, but there's no hosepipe ban here. Whereas Gary, who's just back from Brittany, says there is a hosepipe ban there. That's a small part of the conversation that we're having. I'm more interested in the size of the pay packets and indeed whether or not these countries still have nationalised water and the pollution and wastage. That's the real issue. They're just appallingly run from the point of view of what they're designed to do, what they were founded to do, what they originally existed to do, which is to keep water as clean and as plentiful as possible. But if you're getting paid a ton of money almost for doing the opposite, something pretty profound has broken, hasn't it? Something pretty important has buckled. Chris is in Newcastle. Chris, what made you pick up the phone?
Hi there. So my my sort of immediate concern is with regards to the hosepipe ban. So my local water company hasn't implemented a hosepipe ban yet, but there are rumours that it's going to come in. I totally appreciate that is something that might need to be done, but this is from a company that in October and January were fined twice for dumping sewage into local watercourses, the fines totalling almost £750,000.
Yeah.
And the hypocrisy of them telling me that I can't water my grass because of water shortages when they are polluting the watercourses local to me is almost laughable. The other thing is that the fines are currently being held up and supported by a government that have regularly shown that they are exempt from the rules themselves.
Well, this is fascinating. What an amazing first call. We'll have a little look later at why there is this bizarre Daily Mail Nadine Dorries determination to let Boris Johnson off the hook yet again for the misleading of the House of Commons. But you knit the two together and you see perhaps a very British insurrection, don't you? A very British rebellion unfolding in that, well, everything's built on trust, isn't it, in a society? Yeah. And that includes trust in institutions and companies. I'll pay my water rate, I'll pay my water bill if you fix the leaks and don't pump sewage into my local river. And you're not keeping your side of the bargain, so why should I keep mine? And I don't mind. I mean, it's not right for you to turn on your sprinklers and start hosing down your garden, but it's as if the contract has been broken, isn't it? So why should you keep your end of it?
Yeah, it's just so hypocritical that it's humorous, if anything.
Yeah.
That this current situation, they're turning it round onto us like it's the moral responsibility, but you'll get £1,000 fine.
Yes.
While they aren't upholding their side.
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky, isn't it? I mean, there are rules, not just my own moral compasses on what I can and can't say on the radio. And at this point in proceedings, I wouldn't encourage people to break the hosepipe ban, or indeed to the energy bill conversation is heading rapidly towards people not paying their bills with withholding their payments. But what you're describing is impotence, Chris. You're describing a sense of your citizenship being diminished, aren't you? You're describing a kind of a breach of the social contract, and that's pretty profound. It's a pretty odd leap from a hosepipe, but it makes perfect sense, doesn't it? It's slowly just growing into apathy, if anything. Into what? Apathy?
Apathy, yeah.
As in, what's the point?
Yeah.
Well, that's absolutely. Why I'm asking, why do we put up with it? So before you go, have a crack at answering that.
I don't know if it's necessarily an answerable question.
Why do we put up with it? I mean, no, it isn't. There's not going to be a short answer, but part of it is going to be the demonisation of the alternatives.
Absolutely, yeah, and it's the people don't feel empowered to actually create any influence. So I work in healthcare. I recently emailed the Secretary of State for Health in regards to some concerns. I've not heard anything back. I don't expect to hear anything back because that's just how the system works.
Yeah, no, I think you might be right. Good luck with that. What 0345 6060 973 is the number you need if you want to have a crack at why do we put up with it. Part of the problem is people like Mike in Bracknell. James, you bear responsibility and culpability for this crisis. Okay, that's on me then. I'm sorry about that. We had a candidate who pledged to nationalise essential services, and you took the LBC paymaster line to denigrate him and ensure further Tory rule. Mike, you silly old sausage. You want to support someone who's unelectable, then it's not the fault of people who pointed out that he was unelectable that he turned out to be unelectable. If you're in a bus, Mike, and it's been driven towards a cliff edge, right? And you're praising the driver and talking about how brilliant he is, and I'm sitting next to you on the bus saying he's driving us towards a cliff edge. If you don't do something about this soon, we're all going to get driven over that cliff. I'm stuck on the bus. I'm voting for the same party that you're voting for, but we've got to get someone out of that driver's seat soon, because otherwise we're all driving over a cliff, and then we drive over a cliff, and as we're sitting in the mangled wreckage of the Sharra Bank at the bottom of the enormous cliff, Mike turns to me and says, "It's all your fault, that is. It's all your fault that we just drove over that cliff that you warned us we were going to drive over unless people like me woke up and did something about it. So, Mike, mate, you're part of the reason why people put up with this, because instead of actually seeking meaningful and plausible change, you're much, much happier sitting on the sidelines, lobbing rotten tomatoes at anybody who you don't consider to be ideologically pure enough. Do you know what you are, mate? I'll tell you what your politics is, because I've been thinking about this a little bit lately. Not too much, because it's largely irrelevant, but I'm lucky enough to get quite a lot of contact from people like you. Your politics is about sitting in the crowd, slagging off the team on the pitch. And what's happened in the last few years is that you essentially got invited to come onto the pitch and play football. And you lost 50-0. And now you're back in the crowd, blaming it on everybody else. That terror you felt when you actually walked onto the pitch after a lifetime of claiming you could do a better job than the centre-forward, the centre-back, the goalkeeper, the left wing, the manager, the coach, the physio, sitting there, I could do a much better job. Right, come on then. Come on, Mike, put your strip on. You're playing up front. 50-0 you lost, mate. And it's entirely on you. So do grow up. Charles is in Southwark. Charles, what would you like to say?
James, first of all, it was Balzac who said that, by the way.
Thank you very much. I have a rather erudite listenership. Charles, thank you for confirming it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a conservative voter, and I'm absolutely disgusted by the way that the water companies are behaving. I think it is absolutely unforgivable. And what has happened is that the privatization is a good idea in principle, but if you privatize a public utility, you've also got to leave with it a public oversight.
Yes.
And that's what's fair. And they have to have some kind of independent oversight on over what they do, and particularly what the directors do, and particularly over the compensation committee that awards these people this absurd amounts of money for screwing up our rivers and our seas.
I'm glad you're listening, and I'm glad you rung in, because you remind us that conservatism doesn't have to be rapacious. It doesn't. I mean, far from it. In fact, traditional conservatism, as the word suggests, would be quite a cautious business. But this is the rapacious pursuit of profit, yeah. and the role of Ofwat, the so-called watchdog or whatever it's called, is almost negligible. It would seem.
It is. It is almost negligible because they haven't got the proper oversight within the board, within the operation of the utility companies, to actually do something. And personally, if it was me, yes, I would legislate not only to reduce these bonuses, but I'd also legislate to actually fine the directors for being responsible for what they've been responsible for. The idea of polluting our rivers and our seas is completely and utterly unforgivable.
But you know that
for being upset, I think I would probably have them bloody well shot.
Well, I mean, obviously that's a figure of speech, Charles, and we can't possibly encourage the assassination of water company executives on this programme. I appreciate your tongue was in your cheek, and I'm happy to clarify that. But here's the thing. I mean, I don't know what newspaper you take, but if you were to bring in some of the things that you propose, then columnists in organs like the Daily Telegraph and the Daily Mail would be talking about the left-wing stifling of business and how this is a quasi-socialism, and if you start limiting how much money people can take, it's a disincentive from doing. You've seen it all before, Charles, and it is, I'm afraid, it's noise that comes from your side of the political fence.
Well, I regret that. I regret that exceedingly. But the trouble is that what they've got in the water companies are rather sort of third-rate individuals who can't really do their job properly. And after all, the whole purpose of having a business that works very well is that it works very well for everybody, for your customers, for what you do, for the impact that you have on the environment. And if you have the proper system and the proper spirit in the business, you can make it grow. But if you've got a bunch of idiots who are paying themselves vast amounts of money and screwing up everything, you're never going to get a business that makes any sense.
Okay.
And that's why I'm so annoyed with them.
I understand your annoyance, and a lot of people share it, but final response from me is that actually the model here is screwed. It's not something that can be tweaked and improved to restore it or to fix it, because here is a finite sum of money, and growth for a water company is an odd concept. There's only, there's a finite number of customers, so you can try and steal customers from other water companies perhaps, but essentially you're fighting over the same pie. So here is a finite sum of money that is coming in from your customers, right? And you then have a choice of what to do with that money. You can either spend it on making sure that we're not pumping sewage into rivers on an unconscionable scale. You can spend it on addressing the 3.2 billion litres of water that are lost every day to leaks, 3.2 billion litres every single day. You can spend all that money on making the service better, making the company more efficient, making the rivers cleaner, making the water safer, or you can pay yourself enormous salaries and give what's less to shareholders. There is currently absolutely no incentive, or indeed much limit, it would seem, upon stopping people from doing the second bit of the process. And I don't really see much prospect of there being one in the current economic system. That's the problem for me.
In the absence of any incentive, you need to introduce coercion.
Yes.
And there's no doubt about it that the incentive, you're quite right, isn't there.
Yeah.
But there has to be an intervention by government, indeed by all of us as a state,
Yes.
to make sure these things don't happen. And
But that's red tape, Charles. That's what they call red tape, and your lot are supposed to hate it.
No, red tape is a different matter.
It's not. Red tape is exactly what you're talking about. Red tape is you're going to get punished if you don't make things safer. You're going to get punished if things aren't healthier. You're going to get punished if you don't fix things. You're going to have limits on that. That's red tape. That's what they mean, Charles, when they talk about red tape.
No, they don't. I'm sorry. Red tape is something different.
It's not.
Red tape is bad when, for example, it gets in the way of building new houses, building new affordable houses because the local authority won't give you planning consent. That's the kind of red tape you don't like.
That's not red tape. That's planning law.
It's not red tape at all.
It is red. They would call it red tape. You can't put a limit on how much money we can make. You can't force us to fix leaks when we don't have to. Why should we have to abide by these EU regulations on clean water? That's all red. Anyway. It's been going a very healthy exchange of views, so it's good to have happened upon something we disagree about. 10:31 is the time. Holly Harris is here with the headlines. It is 10:34, and maybe Charles is right. Maybe it's not red tape that is needed here, but I can't think of a better way to describe the sort of rules and regulations that would limit the amount of money that these people can pay themselves, or indeed the amount of dividends that can be passed on to shareholders, that would fine them and compel them to do better when it comes to pumping sewage. You'd have to have a standard, wouldn't you? If you go below this standard, if you go below this benchmark, then you get spanked. A couple of people telling me, including one whose father used to work for a well-known water company, that the calculation is obvious when you think about it, is that whatever fines are in place are economically preferable to to not pumping sewage into rivers. So the system is absolutely screwed. Well, what are you going to do? Are you going to do what's right for the water table, for the pollution levels in our waterways? No, of course not, because it's cheaper. I make more money if I pump the sewage into the river and then pay whatever fines are imposed than I do if I pay for the infrastructure and make the necessary investments to ensure that we're actually cleaning this stuff that we're supposed to be cleaning and not just pumping it untreated into our waterways. And one little misspeak there, the water system is set up in such a way that there's no national grid. So you don't have any choice. You can't really vote with your feet and pinch customers off other water companies, as I now understand it, thanks to you. But I did say at the beginning, I understand the big picture on this, but not, I think, the little picture. Let's make a couple of international comparisons now. I've got callers waiting in Belgium and in Germany and elsewhere, but we'll certainly take those first two. We'll start with Anne, who's in Dendermonde in Belgium. Anne, what would you like to say?
Well, good morning, James.
Hello.
Just to say that we do not have a fully privatized system. So we have a system that's called the public-private partnership,
Right.
which means that mostly on a provincial level, there are water companies. They have different names.
Okay.
Their workers are not civil servants. They are privately employed people.
Right.
But the main shareholders of those companies are the communities and
There
the
it
towns
is.
they
Yeah,
serve, and they
okay.
have mandatories in it, which means that the profit they make, and they do make a profit,
Yeah.
there is an incentive to reinvest it into the infrastructure. Also, a big difference is that every household does have a water meter, which makes it easier to identify
Yes.
and remedy water leaks. And you asked whether there is a hose pipe ban. There isn't one currently. There was one last year when it was a very dry period, and there are always campaigns to use water, of course, responsibly, which take a bigger hold when the water companies aren't wasting water themselves. for obvious reasons. As to dumping raw sewage from the water companies, there isn't this problem. We do have a problem sometimes with farmers dumping manure in water streams, or indeed private companies dumping water, but not from the water companies.
As in sort of chemical
themselves.
companies or something like that, or people who use...
Exactly.
But not the actual... I mean, when you put it like that, we must sound absolutely bonkers to you. So you say, sorry, who's polluting the rivers? Is it that nasty petrochemical plant just up the way there? No, it's not that nasty petrochemical. Is it those farmers using pesticides and fertilizers and not predicting the full amount of runoff because there's been more rainfall? No, it's not the farmers or the petrochemical company. Well, who is it? Who's polluting your rivers? It's the water companies. That must strike you then as absolutely unbelievable.
It does strike me that the discussion is less ideology. It's a different word for a Dutch speaker, but it's not as ideologically charged here in Belgium as it is in the UK. I think you're rather extreme to the A or extreme to the B on privatization, whereas in Belgium people tend to accept that there is an in-between and that there is a good reason to have an in-between for things like utilities. Well,
PPP has an unfortunate connotation here because of, Gordon Brown was getting a lot of praise yesterday. It was a very negative part of his legacy was the PPP practices in the health service. But the sentence that jumps out at me from what you say is that they make profits, but the structure of the system is such that the incentive is to put those profits back into...
Well, yes, because if they didn't put the profits back in, because it's their own councillors and mayors who like to get re-elected, who are in the board of directors, they would notice the next election what people thought of their management. So there is a certain incentive not to let things go to absolute ruin.
And therefore, I think the subtext of everything you say is that they are doing it better in Belgium than we are here, and part of the reason for that will be perhaps I don't know that I agree with the ideological charge. I don't think anyone's calling necessarily for full nationalisation, but just I saw Charles's call was pertinent. Just limits, checks and balances upon the privatised model, so that it becomes economically inviable to pay yourself £2 million a year while you are polluting rivers. I mean, it's actually unthinkable. The more you think about it, the madder it becomes. Sorry, who's polluting the rivers? Oh, the actual water companies. Crikey, I bet some heads have rolled at those water companies. Well, actually, no. They're still due enormous six-figure bonuses because they're paid according to how much money they make for shareholders. They're not paid according to how much water they save from being lost to leakage, or how much pollution they reduce, or indeed how much customer satisfaction is reported, or how hard they work to avoid hosepipe bans whenever the sun comes out. Stuart's in Dusseldorf. Stuart, what would you like to say?
Morning, James.
Hello.
In Germany, we have very strong and strict regulations concerning water. It's normally from the government level. They actually have, if there are any discharges of waste, etc., or contaminants into water, there is actually strong penalties against it. So there are local counties or companies that do that, and they're very strongly regulated. The second point I'd kind of like...
See, there we go. We can have a minor dispute about the exact meaning of the word red tape, but very strongly regulated. I live in a country where two politicians are currently competing to become Prime Minister on platforms that consist in large part of claiming that they will get rid of more regulations than the other person. How does that reach your ears in Dusseldorf? So honestly, you're listening. This is a country where our water system is absolutely banjaxed, and the two people competing to be the next Prime Minister think we've got too much regulation on industry.
It scares the heck out of me, honestly. The level of quality in Europe last year was highest excellent quality was 84.4% across Europe. Obviously, there was some countries like Poland that only had 44.5% that was actually good quality, but that was only because 2/3 out of 450, I think, out of 650 waterworks were checked. But the highest level of excellent quality is 97.7% of water in Europe.
It's incredible, isn't it? And we sit here, I don't know what, I think a lot of the newspapers today are dedicated to trying to call off the investigation into Boris Johnson misleading the House of Commons, or getting rid of flexi time for civil servants, or whatever. There's an excellent woke watch coming up later involving the highwayman Dick Turpin. But we are being gaslit by our own media providers. In fact, someone's just tweeted Or apropos, a completely different conversation about that ridiculous man, David Frost, Lord Frost as he is now, the man who negotiated that brilliant Brexit deal that he then sought to disown before the ink was even dry, writing about wind power in the Daily Telegraph today. And someone is saying, should people like this be given media platforms? They're not given media platforms. They're promoted and amplified by billionaire newspaper owners. And they've also persuaded you the BBC's your enemy as well, the same people. And then you wonder why you can't use your hosepipe in the summer and your river's full of effluents. Thank you, Stuart. Daniel's in Reading. Daniel, what would you like to say?
Hello, James. How you doing, mate?
I'm pretty good. What's on your mind?
Yes. All right. So regarding your question at the start of the show regarding why people...
Why do we put up with it? I've got a bit distracted from that.
Why do we put up with it? Yeah, I've kind of forgot we were talking about hosepipe bans there for a moment. Why do we put up with it? Well, I think a lot of people don't. What I don't see really, particularly right now with the cost of living crisis, what viable options do we have to strike back at the fundamental heart of a system that's put us in this place in the first place? I don't really know. Now, the next election, of course, will be the next real opportunity to sort of drive a stake at the heart of this. But realistically, the credible opposition, being Labour, what are they actually putting forward to do anything about this? Because if they are, it's not coming through loud and clear to me, and I think they'll probably say that with.
But where would it come from? Where would you hear it? So if Keir Starmer goes out for or rather orders in some food after a day's campaigning in County Durham with some of his colleagues, then the best-selling newspaper in the country will put that on the front page for 2 weeks. If Keir Starmer announced his plans for water companies today, where would you go to find out about it?
So you think it's really just generally the issue here? I think part of the problem is Labour need to push harder. This has been true since Gordon Brown was in Downing Street, probably. Since they went into opposition in 2010, they need to find ways of getting to the people. Should be in every studio they're ever invited into. They should be shouting stuff from the rooftops. When they've got a manifesto and when they've got a message, it's still arguably early. But a big part of the problem, in terms of why do we put up with it, is because we're not aware of alternatives. Yeah. And think about what the lady in Germany just said about ideology, is that you're supposed to be either pro or anti-privatisation. We've been so groomed that loads of people who haven't got a pot to pee in think that they're on the side of privatisation because Margaret Thatcher, council houses something woke. That's part of the problem, I think. And it's that middle ground that's been lost. Well, my potential alternative to really put this front and centre, and I think they kind of missed a trick during the lockdown, and I know we've been talking about Amazon workers and Amazon Pay recently.
Yes.
They're potentially one of the biggest workforce in the UK. I think 55,000 roughly at the moment.
Yes.
86% of households use Amazon. If that 55,000 got together and put forward a credible and honest strike and down tools, that would be felt by almost everyone in the nation. That would put it, I don't care what newspaper you are, that would put this issue front and centre.
Yeah, but we've been there. You mean a general strike of sorts?
Absolutely, yeah. Down tools, that's it. Amazon will not produce. Is that not potentially a tool of which to put this front and centre? And then whatever Keir Starmer's views are, they will be heard on what he's going to do about this.
Yeah, I mean, I know what would happen in the event of that unfolding, and at some point, like you have to believe that something will snap, that something will change. And I think this winter, I've got to tell you that there's some research into what the next lot of energy caps are going to look like. There is a sense that something's going to break, and that's a little bit scary. If it involves industrial action and then a capitulation by the owning classes, that would be good. But if it involves something uglier than then be careful what you wish for, because Cornwall Insight, which is an independent business analysis company into the energy market, has crunched the numbers on what the next price cap rise is likely to look like, okay? I'm taking this from the energy and commodities columnist at Bloomberg and the co-author of The World for Sale. And he's using their numbers and concluding that the latest calculation for the electricity and gas UK retail price cap is very, very scary. Okay, this is October. And it's one analysis by one analyst or one company, but a respectable one. Respectable enough for the energy and commodities columnist at Bloomberg to
refer to them, and they're putting the cap in October, which you'll know is currently at £1,971 per year. They're suggesting that in October it could go up to £3,582, and then in January it could go up to £4,266. So, Daniel's the thinking is up with this. We cannot put up with, we cannot cope with this anymore. The energy stuff is even more acute than the water stuff, because the water stuff just involves not being able to swim in rivers or not being able to use your hose pipes in the summer. No one's going to have their water turned off. I think it's actually illegal to turn your water off. But then factor in the other essentials in life, which are energy. Roof over your head, food in your belly, water and energy. That's it. And all of them are under attack now. So I don't know whether a general strike does the trick or whether a downing of tools does the trick, but I do know that something about the current system feels absolutely rotten. And yet right now, if you were to take a straw poll of the country and ask them whether they think we should carry on as we are but do things slightly differently, or whether there's need for a deep and profound systemic change, they'd go with the former. And in order to sell the latter, you need a genius. In order to sell the latter, you need a politician who can change the world. Keir Starmer is not that politician. I don't know whether or not that is what the country needs, but Keir Starmer is not that politician yet. He might be what we need, but he's not the one that's going to bring about a complete and systemic change. And the politician who can bring that about is a politician who can convert people, who can bring them with him, and crucially, who has supporters that are kind and open and welcoming, and who can explain to people what is needed, and who are tolerant of disagreement and dissent, and who exude warmth and compassion and kindness, not people who spend their time on Twitter smelling their own farts. It's 10:49. It is 10:51 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, hopping across the Atlantic now, or at least our attention is not to look at what the water companies are like over there, but to look at what is happening at Mar-a-Lago, the sort of centre of Donald Trump's universe, his Florida resort. For those of us who've been fairly clear on just how depraved and fascistic Donald Trump was from the very beginning, it's become almost dispiriting to track the emerging evidence, and forgive me, of how right we were, because it still doesn't move the needle. One of his key cheerleaders, Alex Jones, the InfoWars character, has had his comeuppance in court this week, $50 million fines for vicious lies about the Sandy Hook school massacre. But Nigel Farage, who of course was a big Alex Jones collaborator, has just moved his grift to CPAC, this sort of very, very right-wing conference where they roll out red carpets for people like Viktor Orban. And Farage now gives exactly the same spiel about Judeo-Christian values being under threat, which is, you know what that's shorthand for, on the stage that Donald Trump shares that he used to do on InfoWars. So the fear that none of it ever sticks has become quite acute in recent months. Which takes us to events overnight. The FBI have raided Mar-a-Lago, Donald Trump's sort of Camelot. And it looks, again, like perhaps it presages something rather serious. But don't ask me, ask Brian Klaas. He is, as you'll know, the professor of associate professor in global politics at UCL and the author of Corruptible, Who Gets Power and How It Changes Us. Brian, what's happened and how big a deal is it?
Well, the FBI has raided Mar-a-Lago overnight looking for documents that are classified that Trump allegedly took with him after he left the White House, and that's a crime. There's a Presidential Records Act that requires the preservation of those records. We know Trump took some boxes. He also has now infamously been known to have shredded documents during his presidency, including sometimes flushing them down the toilet.
Just pause there for me. Just pause for a second, Brian, because people may be hearing that for the first time, and there has actually photographic evidence has emerged of shreds of torn up pieces of paper featuring Donald Trump's headlines sort of loitering unflushed in toilet bowls, which means that his key aides took those, people close to him took those pictures for posterity or possible legal defense. I mean, incredible scenes, really. I think Maggie Haberman got hold of the pictures first.
That's right. And, it's incredibly ironic because Trump, if you remember back in 2016, ran on the premise that Hillary Clinton couldn't be trusted with classified information because she had a private email server, which was secure. Trump has basically taken documents from the White House, apparently illegally, which is why the FBI broke into his safe last night. And also, this is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of criminal investigations. He's facing election fraud investigations in Georgia, investigations related to criminality around the January 6th insurrection, investigations in New York about real estate fraud. I mean, the list goes on and on. So it is heartening to see that someone who has so blatantly flaunted rule of law and sort of challenged the American state to say, actually, the rule of law does apply to everyone, is finally seeming to at least face some level of investigation that's commensurate with the actions that he's undertaken.
I just looking at the dates. Christopher Wray, the current director of the FBI, who put him in post?
He was handpicked by President Trump himself, so he's hardly the deep state Democratic stooge that Trump now says he is, because Trump had a choice of who to pick, and he picked Christopher Wray.
This is the psychology rather than the politics. And you can almost ask this question in the context of 100 different issues on both sides of the Atlantic. But how can Trump's most diehard supporters not understand how ridiculous it is to accuse somebody handpicked by Donald Trump of being part of some anti-Trump conspiracy?
Because this is a system in which loyalty to Trump is the only variable that matters. And for those people, any time that somebody goes against Trump, it is proof in itself that they have now become part of the deep state or part of a plot against President Trump. It's a dynamic that I have seen in deeply dysfunctional authoritarian regimes around the world, where loyalty to an individual trumps everything else in politics. And that is the grip that Trump has on the Republican Party, unfortunately, where there's a litmus test for future Republican candidates that is basically one issue. Do you agree with President Trump, and do you parrot everything he says unquestioningly? If so, you have a very good shot of winning a Republican primary. If not, you are going to be challenged by someone who's willing to toe the Trump line.
I mean, at least there's a reward involved in this. Some people in this country would be asking similar questions about loyalty to Boris Johnson being displayed by some politicians and media outlets. But with them, there's no. I suppose there might be a peerage for a former editor or a seat in the House of Lords for an ex-MP, but it's. I mean, the stakes are lower in many ways in the UK than they are for Republicans in America. But the context, the precedent, the thing with Trump, and you know this, you've written about it, you understand it better than I do. And Bannon has almost sort of said it out loud, hasn't he, about flooding the area with so much sewage that none of it actually matters. With Trump, there's so much depravity, so much investigation, so much alleged criminality that you struggle to perhaps understand the significance of this episode. You just used the phrase, the FBI broke into the safe of a man who was president 10 minutes ago.
Yeah, I think this is something where people have lost the ability to be shocked because so many shocking things happened during the Trump era. And I think we need to remember that this is something that we have to expect much more of our politicians. We have this lowest common denominator, and I would argue this is true on this side of the Atlantic as well, that you sort of just expect politicians to follow what's in their best interest of power and money, and you sort of just say, well, what can you expect? And you know what? We can expect better. We can expect politicians who behave with integrity, but we have to reform the system because Trump is the byproduct, as many of the scandals in British politics are, of a broken system. And when that is replaced, when that is fixed, that's when we'll have politicians who stop breaking the law and start serving the public.
And, well, happy days. And what happens next? We don't know exactly what they were looking for. The FBI, neither they nor the Justice Department have commented on this search. You've listed some of the areas that are currently under investigation, so we can't really speak with full confidence about what this likely presages. But what would the next chapter look like, do you imagine?
Well, the way I think about this is sort of like criminal whack-a-mole, right? There's so many allegations and so many potential crimes that eventually one of them is going to get him. And we have substantial evidence of criminality in many of these cases. I mean, in Georgia, he literally picked up the phone and was recorded telling his subordinate to find 11,000 votes so he could win the election. I mean, in authoritarian countries, that is just blatant election rigging. And in the United States, it is currently something that has gone unpunished. So at some point, I suspect that there will be indictments. It will create massive political shockwaves in the United States because the Republicans will cry foul. But frankly, as an observer who's objective looking at the evidence, it's pretty clear that there has been a lot of criminality in and around the Trump White House, and it's hard to imagine that Trump was not involved in it.
Finally, Brian, a word, if you would, about this CPAC, which a lot of Brits don't fully understand. What is it, and how ugly is it now?
Well, CPAC used to be the sort of who's who of the conservative political movement, and this meant that people running for office and running for president would sort of make their speeches. And to be honest, in the past, it was a bit more innocuous because you'd have people make their firebrand speeches. But now it's sort of a who's who of authoritarians. I mean, you bring Viktor Orban in from Hungary, he gets huge applause, and they have an actual installation, what they call an art installation, of a January 6th convicted insurrectionist in prison outfits, an orange jumpsuit, crying, and people praying around him. I mean, it is something that does not exist in any other industrialized democracy in the world. It's very dangerous that this is one of the two main political parties in the most powerful country on the planet. And
smack in the middle of it, Viktor Orban, who has recently been talking about how the people of different ethnicity shouldn't reproduce together, and our very own Nigel Farage.
That's right. It's incredibly, incredibly depressing.
Brian Klaas, you can say that again. Corruptible, Who Gets Power and How It Changes Us is one of those books that actually helps to clear the clouds, because clarity and understanding are always going to be the best weapons of disinformation and fascism. Let's call it what it is. And Brian, of course, also Associate Professor at UCL. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. The time now is 11 o'clock. It's 4 minutes after 11, and I think, having spoken to Brian Klaas about events in America and the sort of involvement of that great stain upon British politics, that great skid mark upon the underpants of British politics, Nigel Farage, I think we will talk a bit about Alex Jones, actually. A few of you have asked me why I haven't, and the short answer to that is I'm not an expert on it. I know what you're thinking. Well, there's lots of you not an expert on anything, pal. Doesn't stop you shooting your mouth off about all that. But I almost feel a bit embarrassed about not paying attention to this corner of media, because there was a British equivalent to it as well. There was a very odd bloke who used to make videos in his mum's basement, who was like the British strand of InfoWars, this astonishingly corrupt organisation that peddled all sorts of lies about all sorts of things. And the British guy, perhaps inevitably, was praised in Andrew Neil's Spectator magazine at around the time that Andrew Neil was somehow managing to abide by BBC's impartiality rules. So, that might be part of the reason why many people in this country didn't realise how bad it was. And, of course, Nigel Farage was popping up on it with unerring regularity. Imagine that. I mean, imagine knowing that you are collaborating with and therefore validating and perhaps implicitly delivering audience to someone who's accused the families of school massacre victims of being liars and actors. I don't think Farage has a conscience, according to how most of us would deploy that word. But if you ever have the misfortune of meeting him, do ask him about Alex Jones and just how he squared that with his conscience, the endorsement, the collaboration with, the frequent appearances on the programme of a man who lied about, the most toxic lies, the most awful lies. And if you think it doesn't matter here, you're wrong, obviously. But Boris Johnson used the phrase deep state recently in the House of Commons. That's a mark of how infected our democracy is by this sort of disinformation. And it has its roots, I think, in these sort of places. So, what's the appeal? I think the reason why I didn't take it seriously until it was too late, until, Steve Bannon was already in the White House. There's another outfit called Breitbart, which is similarly toxic. And around the time little Tommy Ten Names was turning up outside court, essentially running the risk of committing contempt of court while claiming that he was actually on the side of the victims, these people achieved a degree of prominence that seemed to me to have interplay. There seemed to be intersections And I don't get it, and I still don't get it. I know what racism is. I know what bigotry is. I know what desperation to believe that your own pitiful little existence is somehow worth more than the black fella over the road, because the alternative is to recognise the reality of your own choices, and also, of course, your own commitment to a system that treats you like dirt. So the invitation from right-wing politicians and right-wing media to look down your nose and to feel superior to somebody else is the only chance they've ever got of stopping you from realising whose foot is actually on your throat and why you are stuck where you're stuck, and they continue to live the life of Riley. That ideology, that politics is as old as time. And when someone like Farage starts talking about Judeo-Christian values being under threat, and appearing on the same platforms as Viktor Orban, who talked very recently about why white people shouldn't have children with people of colour, they're all on the same team and they're all punting exactly the same philosophies and ideologies. It's just that even now, very few of them come out with it explicitly. Very few of them come out and say it completely explicitly. But there's something about the Sandy Hook defamations that I still actually can't get my head around. And it may be a peculiarly American process. It may be a peculiarly American process. And during COVID, we learned something, didn't we? During the COVID conversations, we learned something about people wanting to believe things that aren't true. And the judge in this case said something really powerful. Your beliefs do not make something true. So it doesn't matter how many homemade placards you've got in your garden shed. It doesn't matter how many people you've made friends with on Facebook who agree with you. It doesn't matter how many gatherings you attend in Trafalgar Square. Your beliefs do not make something true. And the desire to believe that these things are true is, to me, incredible. Because, look, I'll give you two examples of this guy. One from a while ago, another example of Andrew Neil's journalistic brilliance. This is him interviewing Alex Jones without mentioning that his own magazine, The Spectator, had called the British version of Alex Jones, the British InfoWars contributor. I think they called him a brilliant polemicist or something like that. So he never mentioned stuff like that because he was very, very impartial when he was at the BBC. But here is one of those rare examples of Andrew Neil being on the right side of an exchange, and it's not pretty.
Like this, I believed in...
Hey, listen, I'm here to warn people. You keep telling me to shut up. This isn't a game. Okay, our government in the U.S. is building FEMA camps. We have an NDAA where they disappear people now. You have this arrest for public safety, life in prison.
You are the worst person I've ever interviewed.
No, it's basically off with their heads, disappear
David,
them,
thank you for being with us.
Infowars.com.
It's 11:30. You're watching the Sunday Politics. We have an idiot on the program today. Coming up in just 20 minutes.
You will not stop the Republic. Humanity is awakening. Infowars.com. No. You guys are crazy.
I'll be looking at the week ahead with our political panel. Until then, the Sunday Politics across the UK.
So, why don't you engage with these people? There you go. That's why. Also, a free advert for his ludicrous website bellowed into the microphone. But I just couldn't believe that anybody ever took them seriously, even when Farage was working here and appearing on InfoWars at the same time. So I've got two questions for you. Why? And we'll talk a bit about Farage, because he came out with some stuff last week or at the weekend that is gross. And again, as with Trump, those of us who told you exactly what he was many moons ago derive no pleasure whatsoever from being proved completely right. But how did he get away with it for so long, Alex Jones? And why would Nigel Farage associate with somebody who was perpetrating such disgusting lies? The second question is very interesting to me because I'd never fully grasped. I found Farage, I don't know if you've seen the footage of me interviewing him a few years ago. I found him so easy to destroy, so easy to pull apart and bounce around the studio like a ping pong ball, that I struggle still to understand why other journalists never did it. And also why he managed to exercise such curious power over the British electorate. I understand the appeal of base racism and comforting lies. But it was so easy to show him for what he is, so easy to point out what he is, that I have a sort of bizarre fascination with him. Why would he consort with and collaborate with Alex Jones of InfoWars after the Sandy Hook lies had been injected into public discourse. If you follow these matters closer than I do, then I'd be fascinated to hear your thoughts. But the bigger question, and the more important question, of course, is why? How did Alex Jones get away with it? 0345 6060 973. The man's bonkers. And here he is in court, being caught essentially with his pants on fire.
So you did get my text messages, and it said you didn't. Nice trick.
Yes, Mr. Jones. Oh. Indeed. You didn't give this text message to me. You don't know where this came from. Do you know where I got this?
No.
Mr. Jones, did you know that 12 days ago, your attorneys messed up and sent me an entire digital copy of your entire cell phone with every text message you've sent for the past 2 years, and when informed, did not take any steps to identify it as privileged or protect it in any way. And as of 2 days ago, it fell free and clear into my possession. And that is how I know you lied to me when you said you didn't have text messages about Sandy Hook. Did you know that?
I told you the truth. This is your Perry Mason moment. I gave them my phone, and then...
Mr. Jones, you need to answer the question.
No,
Did you know this happened?
No, I didn't know this happened. But I told you I gave them the phone over.
But just answer the question.
You said in your deposition, you searched your phone. You said you pulled down the text, did the search function for Sandy Hook. That's what you said, Mr. Jones, correct?
And I had several different phones with this number, but I did, yeah. Well, of course. That's why you got it.
No, Mr. Jones, that's not why I have it.
My lawyer sent it to you, but I'm hiding it. Okay.
Mr. Jones?
Mr. Jones,
please just answer questions. There's no question. Mr. Bankston also only asks questions.
Sure. Mr. Jones, in discovery, you were asked, do you have Sandy Hook text messages on your phone? And you said no, correct? You said that under oath, Mr. Jones, didn't you?
If I was mistaken, I was mistaken, but you got the messages right there.
You know what perjury is, right? I just want to make sure you know before we go any further. You know what it is.
Yes, I do. I'm not a tech guy. I told you I gave in my testimony the phone to the lawyers before or whatever, and so you got my phone, but we didn't give it to you.
No, Mr. Jones. One more time. And please remember, if you need to assert the Fifth Amendment, you can. I need to know that you can do that. But you testified.
Okay, so this man is a liar who's just busted lying there. You know he's a liar already. He's evil because of all the people that you would choose to malign in pursuit of clicks and giggles and large sums of money. The parents of murdered schoolchildren, massacred schoolchildren would be very near the bottom of anybody else's list. So he's a liar and he's evil. And he's probably bonkers, whatever we mean by that word. So he's a liar and he's evil and he's bonkers. And it was blatantly and blindingly obvious to anybody paying attention, including, you have to presume, people who were prepared to profit from association with him. And those people include one who became the most powerful man in the world, Donald Trump, and his sort of British poodle, Nigel Farage. And I still don't get that. So how did Alex Jones get away with it? Why did people believe and support Alex Jones? 0345 6060 973. And the question I'd really like you to answer alongside it is, why did people like Trump and Farage associate with him so closely? Why did they get into bed with him? Because you sit here as a British commentator, or I sit here as a British commentator, and I just think, crikey, you'd steer clear of him, wouldn't you? If you were after power, you'd maybe they were shown numbers. Were they shown numbers? I genuinely don't get it. So how did he get away with it? 0345 6060 973. What did he offer to people that they found so irresistible? And why would a failed British politician pursuing the sort of chat show circuit in America, why would Nigel Farage get into bed with Alex Jones? And why would Donald Trump? 0345 6060 973. Because the point I'm trying to make, clumsily, is that anyone who's just been introduced to this character by the events of the last few days, or indeed the clips of the last few minutes, will just think, well, he's clearly bonkers, he's clearly evil, he's clearly a massive liar. And then you will be staggered to discover that he was a bedfellow of Donald Trump and Nigel Farage, wouldn't you? I mean, genuinely staggered. How could those men, particularly if you like either of them, you can have a go at answering this, how could those men get into bed with this? And why did they do it? What was in it for them? 0345 6060 973. And then, of course, the bigger question, and you may need to be American or have links to America to answer this, because it's got to have something to do with guns, hasn't it? But why were people so keen to believe his evil lies? Hit the numbers now, you will get through. It's 11:18. It is 11:19, and I am in I am in that category, I think. The reason I never took Alex Jones seriously was because he was so obviously bonkers, evil, and lying. But the trick I missed, as I also did with Steve Bannon and Breitbart, the trick I missed was how many people were lapping it up. How many people were devouring it, believing it, supporting it, culminating in, with an example from both sides of the Atlantic, Nigel Farage and Donald Trump both getting into bed with him. So, two questions. Why did they do that? That maybe is answered by the scale of people in the second question, which is, how did he get away with it? Why did people go for it? Why did people go for it? Ryan's in Durham. Ryan, what can you tell us?
So, hi James.
Hello.
Basically, I'll start off, I've got a very vested interest in American politics because my wife is American, my in-laws live out there, and I follow this very, very closely because I get a lot of stuff from my father-in-law. We kind of friendly debate this back and forward, but he sends me some very crazy stuff. But he is one of those people who's kind of gone down this kind of pipeline and is still very much deep in it. And the reason people like Alex Jones can get away with this kind of thing and why they're enabled to do what they do is because, you go back to the 1960s when the Republican right kind of galvanized this issue of finding these single issue voters and conglomerating them on one single issue.
Right.
And that's how they get started with these things. I mean, my father-in-law, he votes on, anti-abortion. It's all about protecting the baby, just saying no to anything like that. But he sees things like Alex Jones and, they drag them down into this thing. They say, I get you on this single issue thing, you're protecting the baby.
What single? So I don't know. He's an anti-abortion person, is he, Alex Jones?
Pro-life. He calls himself pro-life.
So your father-in-law starts off with a religious-based conviction, does he, on this? Because I don't want to insult your father-in-law, but I mean, when it comes to refugees, I doubt he's quite as pro-life as he is when it comes to unborn.
Because you get dragged in on this single issue.
Okay.
And the more you hear, the more you learn about the truth, quotation marks, the more you start to see it, there's more to this than that. There's the refugees coming in, they're enemies, they're rapists, they're whatever. And it gets galvanized by people like Jones and projected and picked up by people like Donald Trump. So you've already
lost me, because I'm not unfamiliar with this, particularly Farage, obviously, but the leap from being anti-abortion to believing that Sandy Hook was a hoax or believing that, all foreigners are criminal. I don't quite that. I guess that's because we wouldn't fall for it. Go on.
It's like a pipeline. They get you in on the one thing. So, I don't like the abortion argument. I'm pro-life.
Sure.
I'm not. I'm just saying that's where you are.
Yeah.
So, for example,
no, I understand.
You see, Alex Jones is saying this, and this. You start listening to it more, and then you listen to more of it, and you get more and more of these little ideas that bring you down this pipeline. It's the same way kind of YouTube works with its autoplay feature.
Okay.
You see one video, you see more, and the stuff he sends me now isn't InfoWars. It's some very, very deep down there stuff that I don't even know where it's coming from.
What's the maddest thing he sent you, if you don't mind me asking?
The latest thing he sent me was a documentary by a doctor.
Yeah, don't advertise it. Just give me the content.
Oh, no. Basically, COVID comes from snake venom.
Snake venom? Okay.
Yeah, that's the last thing I heard. And
Is it... Because the thing you like the gateway drug, the entry point.
Yeah.
You love that validation and that vindication so much that you kind of then have to buy the rest of it. And because there's a little gnawing voice in the back of your head saying the rest of it isn't true, you to silence that voice, you have to go all in. I mean, maybe we're coming at it from the wrong angle, but would your father-in-law have subscribed to the Sandy Hook theory put out by Alex Jones?
I mean, I haven't really asked him about it. In terms of gun ownership, we just don't go near that.
But gun ownership is key to understanding this, because Alex Jones gave people... Because, I mean, look, school massacres in a sane universe would have seen gun laws brought in any country in history, and it hasn't happened in America, which means they're desperately looking for reasons to resist that simple logical leap from school massacres to gun laws, and the only way they can resist it is by claiming that the school massacres aren't actually real. So I can understand that appeal.
It starts with the single issue voters. You've got guns. People who just no guns, no gun laws, no regulation, nothing, my gun, my right. So you get those on the single issue voters, and you start giving them these ideas that maybe it's a false flag, maybe they're attacking your gun rights, maybe they're getting this, listen to the truth. And then you start to get this idea of, oh, wait, maybe he's got a point. Maybe the Democrats are doing this. And you start to go down this path where you get that other thing. You get that one more little nugget of what seems like the truth that drags you further into these conspiracies. Before long, you think COVID comes from snake venom.
And the election was stolen.
Yeah. It's...
I mean, we may have just answered the second question. Let's start with Farage, because he's British and so are we. Why would Farage get into bed with him even after the Sandy Hook stuff? What would be in it for Farage?
Probably to kind of bring that kind of ideas into Britain, to try and find the kind of way to get single-issue voters in Britain to fall down a path of where the truth no longer matters, where the facts don't matter anymore, so that they can be removed from reality. And it kind of worked. I mean,
definitely.
The Brexit vote was a petri dish for Trump, and it really kind of worked. Like, anyone who was saying this is probably going to happen, you Project Fear. It's all lies, Project Fear. And you think, no, this is reality. We're removing ourselves from the largest trading bloc on the planet.
And
what do you think's going to happen?
Yeah, well, tell me about it. But without prying unduly, how does your wife feel about what's happened to her dad, or indeed your mother-in-law? If you don't mind me asking, you don't have to answer that question.
Oh, no, it's fine. My wife, she's kind of, from living in the UK for nearly 5 years, she's had the outside view of America, and she is really upset about how America is going. She's upset with how kind of removed from reality her parents have become, just because of the one issue on access to abortion rights.
Is that where it came from? And they're evangelical Christians, are they? Or
Oh no, they're Catholic.
They're full
my wife is Catholic.
Right. Okay.
I'm
Catholic.
She says she's pro-life, and she doesn't agree with abortion, but she doesn't agree with where America is taking this kind of argument towards it.
Fair enough. So that you just need to find well, it is, isn't it? And you know, I mean, the idea that Donald Trump is somehow a champion of that movement is absurd and rather disgusting on every imaginable level. Thank you, Ryan. I mean, keep in touch. The heads up on what's going to happen next. I wasn't surprised that COVID was in the latest video. I was a little surprised to discover that your father-in-law believes it's snake venom. But I've seen people go down these rabbit holes, including sort of people I thought I knew. So I do understand. And in fact, we discovered the best way to have these conversations was not to speak to the actual victims, but to speak to the loved ones of victims. And you get much better insights into these matters. And you've proved that once again. Dorothy's in Westwood Ho. Dorothy, what can you tell us?
Good morning, James.
Hello.
I do have to say that your show is a work hazard for those of us who work from home.
Yes, I can understand that. You should... Thank you.
Yes. Well, anyway, I have to say that I think that Alex Jones is actually a descendant of Rush Limbaugh.
Okay. So this guy, when I started doing this for a living, people used to say to me, do you know how much Rush Limbaugh earns? He earns something like $200 million a year. And I never really... And I had a couple of colleagues who admired him and tried perhaps to ape him, but I mean, just give Brits a quick thumbnail sketch of what he did and why he made so much money.
Well, he really came to prominence in the late 80s, early 90s, and he was a sort of a conservative talk radio host, and he became embraced by Bush Sr., who was invited him to the White House to help him, attract his audience as voters, etc. And he was very, he appealed to some of the ugliest aspects, calling feminists, feminazis.
Okay, so hating women?
Yeah, women, immigrants, minorities, and playing on that. And it wasn't as crazy and insane as Alex Jones, what he says, but you talk about desensitization.
Yes.
And it's kind of the degeneration of his thoughts and his train of thought. And it's kind of his listeners are morphing into Alex Jones.
Well, if you want to get famous, you'd have to go further. So you'd have to go further than Rush Limbaugh to get famous.
Well, and they saw the money he made. So, you know, and it's just, and it does, and the people who listened to him kind of progressed on to Alex Jones, you know, if they discovered social media and internet, I don't know. But it's even happened, you talk about falling down a rabbit hole, it's happened to my brother.
Really?
Yeah. And it's quite sad. And, you know, to the point that, you know, he had a go at his niece, my daughter, who's 19, who was quite fired up about the overturning of Roe v. Wade. You know, she's a 19-year-old university student, you know, and she said something, and then the likes of the USA is turning into a third world country wrapped in a Gucci belt. Wow. And he took umbrage to that. And so it's really, there's just no...
What then? What was actually, because you're the second person, I wasn't expecting abortion to feature so prominently in this conversation, and it's a glib throwaway line. But what is it about abortion that appeals to these people? Because they don't really like humans unless they're exactly like them. They don't. I mean, certainly, you know, you've got desperate people at the border, or I think it's fair to say that the inscription at the bottom of the Statue of Liberty has been completely erased by Donald Trump. How can they be claimed to be pro-life when they're also pro-death penalty and pro-treating life appallingly when it's someone desperate fleeing their own country?
Yeah, I think there are two things. Partly it's about control, and the loss of maybe what they see as traditional roles in society, and also the fact that you never underestimate the hold that a certain branch of evangelism. I can't even speak.
Evangelical Christianity.
It has in the States. And there are people who I've known most of my life who I went to school with, and you can't. There's no reasoning with it.
It's like a sort of a pornography of fear, things to be frightened of that they actually somehow find arousing. Wayne in Basildon has used that phrase, hardcore porn fear. I don't know that you would use that phrase, Dorothy, but it seems a neat distillation of some of what you've described. But that desire to believe it. And of course we forgot about sexual autonomy for women being absolutely anathema to a certain type of man, because deep down they hate women. They hate the fact that they can only ever have sex when a woman agrees, and pine for the days when you couldn't actually, and that was true in Britain relatively recently, is that it was impossible to rape your own wife. 32 minutes after 11 is the time. Holly Harris is here with the headlines. And it matters, doesn't it? You can talk about it being good news that Alex Jones has been spanked in court, but you look at his legacy and the fact that most obviously Donald Trump got into bed with him, Nigel Farage got into bed with him. Many people in this country remain enamoured of both of those individuals. So, you know, the question of how it works, because someone else will come along now. That's the point, isn't it? I think that's something we can all agree about. Someone else will fill the gap. There's always people nibbling away at whoever is the most prominent hate preacher at the moment, whether it's Hopkins or little Tommy Ten Names or Farage, or whether it's Alex Jones or Rush Limbaugh, as Dorothy just reminded us, or Trump himself. There's always someone just waiting in the wings, ready for the stage to be vacated, and then they'll slide in. So how do they get away with it? And why would abortion, COVID, gun laws, immigration, I mean, what is it about these issues that you would define? What would be the defining feature? What do they all have in common? 0345, and of course racism. 0345 60609 73. Levy is in Newquay in Cornwall. Levy, what would you like to say?
So it's very nice to speak with you.
Likewise.
I used to follow some of the beliefs that Alex Jones espouses when I was a very young man.
Yeah.
I was raised in the American Southeast, where they preach tyrannical government is coming to get you. They want to take your guns. They want to take your rights.
Okay.
So Alex Jones, in the early to mid 2000s, when I was in university, was one of those people who took the stance of the government's coming for your guns. Yeah. As I progressed through university, and actually learned about the world around me, your eyes start to open to just how bonkers this person can be. So what he does is he preys on what we would call already vulnerable people.
Yeah.
The poor, the uneducated, people who are already a little weary of the government itself anyway.
Mm.
And so, he grabs them by playing on the fears and the emotions, and things that otherwise would be able to be worked out logically become an emotional response of someone could not possibly have walked into a school and murdered 26 children. So this must be a way for the government to take these things away from us.
Oh, I see. So it's wrong end of the telescope time, isn't it? It's you start with the belief that you are under threat, that they want your guns and they'll do anything to get them. Once you believe they'll do anything to take your guns away, then the door is open for something as outwardly bonkers as staging a school hoax.
Yes, and it happened massacre. With COVID as well, where they will do anything to get Donald Trump out of office. So COVID is now a massive conspiracy to steal an election.
Okay, because it worked.
And the reason that people like Trump and Farage will get into bed with a man like Alex Jones, and it's also why no one stands up to him, is the network of people who follow him online is so vast.
Is it?
That they can take a conspiracy such as what the previous caller said of COVID comes from snake venom, and essentially turn it into a fact. What is it? Kellyanne Conway called it an alternative fact in 24 hours, and it's all over right-wing news. And the reason no one stands up to someone like Jones is because that same network will dox, harass, and even show up at the homes of people who question it. And the Sandy Hook parents have finally become the only ones who have been willing to or strong enough to actually stand up to the online harassment and finally get Alex Jones in court and expose him for the fraud that he is.
Because, in a sense, they'd already lost the most precious thing they could lose. So the leverage of his supporters is diminished. If you've lost your baby, if you've lost your child, you're going to be less. And I know many people had to move house, they had to change their names. There's some astonishing stories of the measures that these families have had to take to avoid Alex Jones's followers. But there has got to be something, I think, in the idea that if you've lost your child, you are more equipped to take up this fight than somebody who hasn't. Am I making sense? I don't want to sound simplistic, but I'm just thinking about what would I do in those, because in those situations, the first thing you think of is your children. And when you boil it down
to its basest form, they have literally lost everything they could possibly lose. So what more can these insane people on the internet possibly take from them? The people who lost loved ones in Aurora, Colorado to James Holmes with the Batman shooting.
Yeah.
The families in Buffalo, the families in Charleston, South Carolina, this online presence will harass, release your information, show up at your home, and they bully you into being quiet. And it's gotten to a point now where the Sandy Hook families from Uvalde, Texas, who lost their children in recent months, have finally realized there are more of us now who back them than are willing to stand by and watch them be harassed. The Alex Jones generation, the Trump generation, the Republican base here is slowly but surely, and it sounds terrible, but it's slowly but surely dying out. And every generation in the U.S. is more progressive than the previous.
And that terrifies them too.
It does.
That's why woke has been invented. That's why woke has become a thing to rail against and to fear and to fight.
You have the Parkland survivors from Florida holding rallies, being thrown out of congressional hearings for trying to make the point of, we survived the death of 19 of our classmates. Please do something. And now that the younger generations are willing to take that stand, some of these families have realized, hey, we're not doing this alone anymore. So maybe we can show him for what he is. And so Trump and Farage will latch on to that, to his insanity, because there are still people that are willing to pump it out online, unadulterated.
And they pay their wages in a sense. They get their support and their validity, and in some ways their income from the same base, from the same supporters. I got two more questions. So I'm so glad you were listening today. You can probably guess what one of my questions is, which is what I mean. You mentioned university, and I understand the role that critical thinking would play in a process like this. But what broke the spell for you, Levy? What sort of, and how did you feel when it broke?
I grew up in a very rural town in the state of Alabama, 1,800 people, very insulated. My father was a teenager in the American South in the 50s and 60s, who, God bless him, kind of broke some of his bigoted views as I grew up. But when I got to an area of where I went to school with 200,000 people in the city, the university has 40,000 on campus, just being exposed to other people, other beliefs, and other ideas kind of opened it up for me.
So because your beliefs became unsustainable, essentially, you couldn't cling to these beliefs when there was so much evidence contradicting them in front of you every day.
Absolutely. Being away from the echo chamber kind of broke the spell of, this is what we believe, this is what we've always believed, and this is what we know to be true. Because eventually you get out in the world and realize none of this is actually true.
That's the incredible thing that's the incredible thing from the outside. None of it is actually true. The problem is perhaps, and this is why your age might be relevant, and I hope your optimism isn't misplaced, but social media now has allowed these people to create a false ecosystem, hasn't it? A self-sustaining ecosystem where they support each other's delusions and they support each other's lies.
It has, but what's happening, especially in the States, is now they're being relegated to having to create their own social media platforms.
Yeah.
Parler, Truth Social, the one that the Crazy Pillow guy created. They've had to create their own because now I'm 37, so I'm on that borderline of Gen X and millennial. So I'm a centrist in the States. I own a couple of handguns. Do I need them? No, I would willingly give them up if that's what they wanted. But I'm also very socially progressive. Marry who you want, your body, your choice. As long as you're not inconveniencing anyone, do what you need to do. Live your life. We've gotten now to where people of my age group, the younger generations, have told these people the things you are saying and doing online is unacceptable. You have become a hazard to public health. You have become a hazard to the mental health and well-being of younger kids. Yeah. The bootlicking, essentially, of American police forces and believing that they can do no wrong is a health hazard to minorities in our country. And we have told them, look, this is unacceptable. We will not take this from you anymore. You've inflicted this on us for most of our life. You've made the world we live in almost unsustainable. So we're going to do what we can do to fix it and change it. If you want to create your own space, that's fine. But in the public space with the rest of the world, we're not going to let you do this and occupy this space anymore.
Because ultimately, reality has to matter and objective truth has to, forgive the pun, has to trump lies. Ultimately, it does. And it's surprising to me how long it takes sometimes to get there. Levy, you're going to be one of my favourite callers of all time, I think, because not only have you really got my... but you've brought something to the table I hadn't seen before, a better understanding of all the links, all the... almost the sort of momentum that gets built up and where it leads. So I owe you one. All right. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much.
No, thank you very much. And I hope we talk again. Wow. It's 11:46. It is 11:49. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where a lot of love coming in for Levy. And you can see why, can't you? This is why we do what we do. Sometimes you get a call that just blows the doors off, whatever it is that is under discussion. But don't be put off. I mean, he's lived it. The rest of us mostly are watching it, or indeed enduring the horrors of seeing a loved one fall for it. And it is profoundly important. There's a great piece in the Times today by Hugo Rifkind that essentially points out that the disintegration of public truth is great news for those who weren't terribly keen on it in the first place. I'll read you a bit. He says it was Sir Max Hastings, Boris Johnson's former editor at the Daily Telegraph, who said of our outgoing Prime Minister, "I would not take Boris's word about whether it is Monday or Tuesday." As Prime Minister, Johnson knew every time he brazenly played with the truth that his supporters would find a way to believe him. Not much has changed. This weekend, his allies attacked the Commons Privileges Committee, which is probing all that. It's rigged, it's a witch hunt, it's a constitutional travesty, it is moving the goalposts. In other words, whatever it is about to say in its efforts to uncover the truth, his supporters should rest assured that alternative truths will be available. And Levy just used that phrase that Kellyanne Conway coined, the idea of there being alternative facts. That's what Nadine Dorries is doing right now. She is cultivating alternative facts. It's what the Daily Mail is doing right now. They are cultivating alternative facts. This is an article by Hugo Rifkind about Alex Jones. And it is both supremely unsurprising and absolutely heartbreaking that it inevitably extends to include the current Prime Minister and his ludicrous cheerleaders. And Truss is doing it too. Every time she says something wrong, she claims that it's been misinterpreted. Every time she makes a fool of herself, she blames it on the media. Every time she said something the other day, I'll read you the quote. It is quite frustrating that female politicians always get compared to Margaret Thatcher, whereas male politicians don't get compared to Ted Heath. This was days after she dressed up as Margaret Thatcher for the first TV debate, as Rifkin points out. I mean, literally dressed up as her. Quite incredible. But there we are. We are looking at a world in which people still thrive from essentially selling the notion that your beliefs do make something true. 11:51 is the time. And for me, at least, the best bit, one of the really interesting bits about that conversation with Levy and his very optimistic approach to progress and generational change is suddenly understanding why woke is so important to these people. Because if the direction of traffic really is towards the light, if we are heading back towards the days when objective reality and evidence mattered, where you didn't have alternative facts or alternative truths, where you didn't defend your hero or heroine regardless of what the facts and evidence were, then they desperately need a new enemy.